is within each of us a twin destiny, the natural and the supernatural. The cards are attracted to the supernatural part of that destiny.
The terrifying horror of a dreaded man called Dr. Terror, who, with his deck of mystic cards, could foretell destiny. Horrors the screen has never before dared to depict.
Of all kind of the films from my childhood, Amicus ones were always piqued my interest because of the invariable format was something that I adored, which is the idea of this telling of 4 or 5 stories in one package.
One of the interesting things about Amicus, given that they became second only to Hammer really as a producer of British horror films, is that it was set up by a couple of New Yorkers. Roughly speaking, Max J. Rosenberg was the businessman, and he stayed in the New York office for the most part. Milton Subotsky was the creative director, if you like, and he in fact relocated to England.
And ostensibly their aim was to get their hands on some of the money from the Eady levy, which was a tax incentive for filmmakers. So it's set up for business reasons, but Milton Subotsky, I think, had a real love of film, and horror film and genre film in particular.
Milton Subotsky had the idea for writing some of these stories as early as 1948, when he was working on a TV show called Lights Out. And they kind of lay dormant for a while. And in 1957, he resurrected them and had this idea that he'd make a 2.5-hour film of 6 stories, which he would then cut up later on into a TV series and get Boris Karloff to introduce. It didn't happen, but one of the stories, because Subotsky, great producer, didn't want to lose anything, one of the stories was called Witchcraft, and a couple of years later he got George Baxt to write the scripts for City of the Dead based on this story. So that was one of the stories that was originally going to be in his Dr. Terror's Tales of Horror, I think it was called. It wasn't the House of Horror at the time, it was called Tales of Horror.
Subotsky hit upon a fantastic title, Dr. Terror's House of Horrors. There had been a film, which I believe is now lost, back in the early 40s with that title, which rather naughtily cannibalized chunks of old feature films and slung them together with newly shot linking material. So that's where Subotsky got the title. I think where his horror films are concerned, the really important formative influence for him was that in the late 40s, he was writing half-hour television scripts, self-contained stories that had to be told very economically, very punctually. And another thing he did at this period was cut up old westerns for sale to television, and he used to eviscerate these westerns and reduce them too to 26-minute slots. And by his own account, this gave him a very good grasp of how to tell stories as economically as possible.
He admitted quite openly that his inspiration for making Dr. Terror's House of Horrors was the Ealing film Dead of Night, made in 1945.
He absolutely adored Dead of Night to the degree that Cushing's opening line in Dr. Terror's House of Horrors, when he says, "I think there is room for one more in here, is there not?"
I think there is room for one more in here, is there not?
Is effectively a quote from the Phantom bus conductor, played by Miles Malleson in Dead of Night, who famously said, "Room for just one more inside."
Just room for one more inside, sir.
There had been a few of these anthology films along the way since Dead of Night, Three Cases of Murder being a particularly good example. And of course, Ealing had done several of their own. A Train of Events is possibly the one that's most relevant here, which also features a group of characters getting on a train and heading to their doom.
But on top of that, I think you can look at pretty much every story in this film and spot the recent release, by recent I mean recent to 1948, that inspired them. The werewolf story gives us a female werewolf. Well, you know, Columbia made a not very good film in 1944 called Cry of the Werewolf, which had Nina Foch as exactly that, a female werewolf.
Well, Ed, I never thought I'd be giving lectures on werewolves to guys like you.
The Creeping Vine story, yes, it predated the Day of the Triffids, given when Subotsky actually wrote it, but nevertheless, Universal had made a little B-movie in 1945 called The Spider-Woman Strikes Back, in which Gail Sondergaard played a sort of female mad scientist called Zenobia Dollard, who was experimenting with sentient plants and was very, very fond indeed of her malevolent plants. The voodoo story as well as quoting from the Cornell Woolrich story, reminds me of a 1944 film called Zombies on Broadway, which had Bela Lugosi in it, starred a couple of Abbott and Costello clones who go to the West Indies and bring back a real-life zombie to perform at a New York nightclub called the Zombie Hut. You know, again, the basic idea of transferring ancient sacred stuff to the crass commercial world of American and, in the 1964 film, British showbiz is there present in Zombies on Broadway. The disembodied hand story fuses together two films of the mid-40s. Of course, it references The Beast with Five Fingers, which is a marvellous Warner Brothers film of the period, with Peter Lorre fantasizing, or does he, the severed hand of Victor Franzen.
You were right all the time. It was Ingram's hand that committed murder.
With, you know, a really extremely good severed hand in that. But also a Universal programmer called House of Horrors, which was about a psychotic sculptor played by Martin Kozlek, who is bedeviled by very, very snooty critics who loathe abstract artists. And one of them is played by the very distinguished British actor Alan Napier.
I call it surcease from toil.
And I call it tripe. Pure, unadulterated tripe, with an overtone of sheer lunacy.
Oh, you don't care for it.
I loathe it.
And he suggests that all these abstract artists should be put in some cosy institution with hot and cold running straitjackets, which is a line that, you know, Christopher Lee could have said.
Yes, indeed. A work of notable incompetence, even from Mr. Eric Landor.
You don't like my work, Mr. Marsh?
The vampire story, frankly, plays very like Cat People. As well as having a Luton Walk, quoted directly from Cat People, it has an American young man who has married a foreign woman, who has some strange lineage, some strange heritage. The character in Cat People refers to himself as a good plain Americano, and that's very much what Donald Sutherland is in The Vampire Story. In The Vampire Story, she's French. Of course, in Cat People, she was Serbian. There is also a very dodgy doctor. There's a very dodgy psychiatrist in Cat People. So when Subotsky said, and he did point out in 1972 or 3, that, you know, Dr. Terror's House of Horrors is where it all began. The script was an original. I wrote it all myself. I don't think he was being strictly honest there. Now, there's nothing wrong with that. Frankly, there's nothing original under the sun, is there? But when you do consider that it was written in 1948, and you think about the horror movies that Subotsky is very likely to have seen in the 2 or 3 years preceding that, then I think you can see the bare bones of Dr. Terror's House of Horrors laid out exactly.
To most young audiences at the time, this would have seemed like quite a fresh new idea.
He thought, well, if I do one, I'll have a vampire, a werewolf, and it seems like the classic thing you would do. Maybe it seems obvious now, but to think that that was a film that was laid out for audiences to watch in 1960s, that would have been quite something, I think. What a fantastic treat to get all those monsters in one film.
Before Dr. Terror's House of Horrors was released, I think there was a feeling that this film was going to do some business, because somebody organised with Pan Books to do a novelisation of Dr. Terror's House of Horrors, and they picked the king of British novelisations at that time, John Burke, which is here, and it's a very, very good novelisation. And John Burke had the great thrill of his novelisation being translated into German. And it came out as Die Todeskarten des Dr. Schreck, the death cards of Dr. Schreck. And for some strange reason, previous DVD releases of this film here have included the German title sequence, which always struck me as a bit strange.
The terrifying horror of a dreaded man called Dr. Terror, who, with his deck of mystic cards, could foretell destiny.
Dr. Terror's House of Horrors was shot at Shepperton. The budget, I gather, was around £100,000. And in fact, it's all completely studio-based. It's in Technicolor and Techniscope. Now, Techniscope was a widescreen format, clearly a scope format, but it was a budget scope format, as it were. It was what's called a 2-perf system, so that you'd get double the amount of images on each frame. So you only used half the amount of film. So this was very popular with the lower budget filmmakers. So when you blew it up to big screen size, it It looks slightly more grainy than CinemaScope and the better scope format. But still, it looked good on the poster. You could really see that the money was on the screen.
He was entrusting Freddie Francis with the responsibility of Amicus's first horror film.
Well, Freddie Francis had been a great cinematographer before he turned director. He turned director in 1962 with a film called 2 and 2 Makes 6. And he went to work for Hammer Films.
He'd made two of their psychological thrillers, Nightmare and Paranoiac, both in 1962. And late in 1963, he'd actually progressed to Hammer's Gothic area by taking over from Terence Fisher in their Frankenstein series, directing The Evil of Frankenstein. Freddie Francis was very much the sort of coming man.
He was seen as a safe pair of hands.
His cinematography, you know, was Oscar-winning, in fact.
With this film, that's a really important element of his contribution. Obviously, he was working with Alan Hume, the cinematographer, because it's one of the things that really makes the film. Sequences like the linking sequence within the train carriage. It's a very, very limited space they've got to use in there, but he does some very creative things with that space. The wonderful lighting, the sort of green lighting, which is sort of shining on Peter Cushing's bag as he's turning over the cards. All these things really create a fantastic atmosphere with, as I said, with very little resource, in fact. Clearly getting such a fantastic bunch of actors together was really key.
Excuse me?
The arrival of each one of them and thinking, oh, these are our principals, was always a lovely thing to kind of to enjoy. You know, you think, oh, I wonder what his story's going to be. And there are 5 gentlemen, and then a 6th arrives in the form of Peter Cushing. Peter's entrance is great, with a hand wiping clear the mist from the window.
Pardon me, I think there is room for one more in here.
He's having fun with that voice, because you don't quite know where he's from. It's literally like he is in disguise. He's got his box of tricks out, and they've thought you could have a beard, you could have eyebrows, you could have a hat. And he's gone, well, all of it. We'll have all of them. Which is probably what I would do. Because I think the first thing to say about Dr. Terror's House of Horrors is there isn't a house of horror. There's no house.
This deck can forewarn us. I call it my House of Horrors.
Even that is a twist in its own weird way, that they're not getting on a train to go to a house and have 5 stories told to them. This is going to happen right here in the carriage, and that's delicious, I think.
Dr. Schreck, Doctor of Metaphysics?
And he has his explanation of his name.
Schreck is a German word, isn't it? Means fright, fear, something like that.
The more exact translation would be terror.
And it's a great word, terror, because it's very rarely used, I think. It always feels quite chilling when placed carefully, and in this context it's quite apt. And lovely to have him as kind of the evil one.
Subotsky's real coup in making this film was in getting together Peter Cushing and Christopher Lee. They were already fused in the public mind as the great totemic figures of the British horror boom, and Subotsky got them.
The science which investigates the first principles of nature and thought.
And nonsense.
It's a transitional moment because Cushing's supremacy is beginning to shift. At the time of this film, he gets a special credit, and Peter Cushing, as Dr. Schreck. But Christopher Lee is actually top billed, and so there's a sort of power shift going on.
If change is possible.
Really? Do we have to suffer all this nonsense?
The wonderful chemistry between them is right there for you. Lee is the classic debunker, you know, referring to the whole lunatic fringe, of which Schreck is obviously an exemplar, and Cushing just, you know, it just has that wonderful calm gravitas, just looking at all these guys, knowing what's in store for them.
Spiritualists, table rappers, the entire lunatic fringe. They've been exposed for the charlatans they are over and over again.
And curiously enough, in 1971, they were together again on a train in an Anglo-Spanish film called Horror Express.
Travel with us, if you dare, on the Horror Express.
I think in a way, Subotsky, in casting them in the roles he cast them in, was riffing on their public personas, if you like. Because when Cushing arrives and announces himself as Dr. Schreck, i.e. Terror, he actually says an unfortunate misnomer, for I am the mildest of men. And of course, to those in the know, Cushing was the gentleman of horror.
An unfortunate misnomer, for I am the mildest of men. However, I sometimes foretell things that are frightening.
And again, with Lee is absolutely perfectly cast because the Franklin Marsh character plays to me like a parody of the industry persona that he had. I think people felt that, you know, he was the perfect professional and a very good actor, but I think there was a perception that he was rather stiff and unyielding, and some people, you know, have suggested even slightly pompous.
Anybody who believes that will believe anything.
I can tell you from personal experience, he actually wasn't any of these things.
I must warn you, gentlemen, this is undoubtedly a well-rehearsed prelude to some shabby form of confidence trick.
But what's brilliant about him in this, I think, is the petulance of the character. It's very different in Christopher Lee. I watched it again recently and loved it for it not being like the Lee we've maybe just come to expect.
You can fool all these others as much as you please, Doctor, but kindly leave me out of it.
Because he was early and he was younger, and maybe it was beaten out of him, but it just felt like it was a different way to go with that character, and lovely, and there were really great choices he made.
Most informed people have heard of Franklin Marsh, art critic.
The "don't you know who I am" thing is entirely in keeping with his character. He's so self-important, he's so pompous that he looks slightly crestfallen.
Well, I've never heard of you.
That even a lowly jazz musician doesn't know who he is. That would have crushed Franklin Marsh, to be honest.
Hey, that's a funny-looking deck, man. How do you play poker with these?
The tarot, if we believe Christopher Lee, of course.
They're tarot cards.
Tarot cards were wonderful. But you could always rely on Christopher Lee to suddenly throw in the sort of, which is presumably the correct pronunciation, but lost in the mists of time.
You are familiar with the tarot?
It was interesting because tarot cards hadn't really been seen much in British film or television at that point.
The tarot deck is a picture book of life.
Back then, we hadn't really seen it that much.
How does it work?
The person whose fortune is to be told touches the cards 3 times.
That you tap the cards 3 times, and then he shuffles them. And then he deals out 4 cards, and the 5th is the ultimate fate.
If you actually look at the cards that he lays down, most of them do sort of relate in some way to what's coming up in the story. So Subotsky, or someone at Amicus, clearly thought that one through.
I think it's quite interesting that it's a very international cast of characters as well. Donald Sutherland and Neil McCallum were both Canadian. Alan Freeman obviously was Australian. And of course, in a way, they had to be, because had they all been English, there's no way they would have talked to each other on public transport, because that's just not done.
The terrifying horror of the dead, entombed for 200 years, that creeps its way back to terrorize the living.
The first story deals with the actor Neil McCallum, and he goes back to his ancestral home to do some architectural work, as one does. The house is quite a claustrophobic kind of location. It does create a really good atmosphere. And then, of course, they go into the cellar, which is where it all really happens.
Very quickly, they unearth a coffin in the walls,
revealing the dusty remains of Cosmo Valdemar. And you have to wonder if maybe Dario Argento saw this, because a very similar sequence does turn up in Deep Red many years later.
But it really relies on atmosphere and very much on production design, I think. Bill Constable was Amicus's production designer on this occasion, and the coffin, particularly of Cosmo Valdemar, is it's a lovely piece of design with that sort of lupine effigy on the front of it.
It's shot very effectively, I think. Again, you've got the nice green glow in some of the sequences, particularly when the werewolf apparently seems to attack Ursula Howell's character.
McCallum seems to know all about it and melts down a cross, ready to shoot it. And the twist of the segment is that it's the woman herself that is the werewolf.
I had 6.
You mean these?
So it's quite a complicated explanation in the last minute of the story, as she's growing nails and he's turning into a werewolf to get him.
There is definitely a male bias within the film, and there is not a lot for the women to do.
My husband was a very wonderful man.
The one real exception in Dr. Terror's House of Horrors is the character played by Ursula Howells, rather appropriately, Ursula Howells playing the werewolf.
It feels unusual to have a female werewolf, and it is a surprise when you see her with her nails.
I think it's a nice twist on the werewolf story, yes, certainly to bring a woman into it. And she's absolutely fantastic, and she really relishes that part. She had a brief spell of doing horror films. And after 5 years after this one, she did the film Mumsy, Nanny, Sonny and Girly, which is a real cult favourite. She's the real standout female character. And one of the great pleasures of the film is the fantastic cast. I mean, you've got wonderful, experienced stage and film actors such as Edward Underdown, who's literally got a few seconds in the werewolf sequence as an architect.
Oh, how they talk. Are you busy?
Another feature of the werewolf story that I like is Peter Madden as the Scottish retainer, Caleb. Peter Madden appeared in quite a number of horror films, and I don't think this is verbatim, but he basically said, you know, I always play these lugubrious characters because I've got this bloody ugly mug. You know, he said something along those lines, and I think he was selling himself short there. He had a fantastic face, and you love to see Peter Madden turn up in anything.
Aye.
And I think he had his apotheosis a couple of years after this when he played the police chief in Frankenstein Created Woman, and he has some marvellous material in a courtroom sequence in that. Freddie Francis was very faithful to actors that he liked. He had made The Evil of Frankenstein for Hammer about, 9 months before doing this film, and there'd been a mute beggar girl in that playing quite an important role, Katie Wilde, and he duly cast Katie Wilde in the werewolf segment as Valda, which I think is a red herring name meant to make us think, oh, she's something to do with Cosmo Valdemar. But of course, she ends up savaged by the werewolf herself.
Prior to this, there were very few female werewolves in the cinema. We'd had She-Wolf of London, Cry of the Werewolf, and Aquanetta in Captive Wild Woman was a kind of a werewolf. So they were still very, very rare at the time. So again, it was unusual. And I think it helped in the twist of the story that all the way through, the protagonist is expecting the wonderfully named Cosmo Valdemar to turn up at some point, being the werewolf. And I think the audience was expecting Cosmo Valdemar to turn up. And then to have that sprung on them at the end, that actually, no, he's this rather nice lady he'd gone to help. He's actually the werewolf. I think that's actually probably one of the most effective twists in the film, simply because we didn't see that one coming.
Subotsky was, let's face it, a bit of a magpie. The baleful lycanthropic ancestor in the werewolf story is called Cosmo Valdemar. Now, anybody with a smidgen of training in Edgar Allan Poe will know the story, the facts in the case of Monsieur Valdemar, and they'll think, well, maybe there's an experiment in this story to suspend somebody at the point of death. Well, they won't find it. They'll find a topic that Poe never touched, namely werewolves. But nevertheless, Valdemar, it's got a good ring to it. Oh, and it was used recently, Subotsky, I'm sure, was aware it was used recently in a portmanteau film made by Roger Corman, Tales of Terror, which had a Valdemar adaptation in it. In fact, it had Vincent Price as Valdemar. So that's a good name, let's use that. It's a very effective little story. I think it does what all opening stories in anthology films should do. There's no great razzmatazz attached to it. It's not the best story in the film, but it's a very nice taster.
Dr. Schreck, I'd like to try those cards.
The Creeping Vine story is one of several instances in Dr. Terror's House of Horrors where you can see Amicus's legacy of pop musical films. Its Trad Dad is probably their most famous title,
which featured artists on the EMI label. That was a huge hit for them, huge box office hit. And they followed it up with another film called Just for Fun, which is very badly misnamed. It's a terrible film.
And on we go with the Teenage Party campaign, ladies and gentlemen.
Well, for Dr. Terror, they brought in Alan Fluff Freeman, the well-loved DJ who even at that stage was a faithful guide to pop pickers up and down the land.
A very strange choice, I think, for the leading man. He was well known as the Radio 1 DJ doing Pick of the Pops, and of course he'd been on Jukebox Jury week in, week out for some time.
Not even home yet, and back to work already.
Unfortunately, he's not the world's greatest actor. He very sensibly went back to radio after this. He turned up a few years later as God in The Young Ones, very strange bit of casting. And I think his last major role was Call Me Cobber in Absolute Beginners. He very sensibly stuck to playing DJs in all his other roles.
And they gave him a really, frankly, very boring part. A guy who has done nothing to deserve the terrible fate that we presume befalls him. For some reason, he comes back from holiday and his house is besieged by sentient plant life.
The terrifying horror of man-killing vine with a human brain that creeps and kills.
The Creeping Vine, it forms part of a very small obsession that British film, television and books have had with killer plants. We seem to have really fallen for them over the years. The Avengers, of course, met one in The Manhunter of Surrey Green. We had the terrible Woman Eater in 1958. Freddie Francis, of course, had a go at it again in Tales That Witness Madness, where he had the killer tree. And the daddy of them all, of course, was Day of the Triffids.
It started when the Earth passed through a storm of meteorites that transformed a strange breed of carnivorous plants known as triffids into flesh-eating, man-killing monsters.
Freddie Francis had actually co-directed, just a couple of years earlier, the film version of The Day of the Triffids. And a director called Steve Seakley had directed the bulk of it, but the producers felt that the film needed to be padded out because it wasn't the right length, so they devised various lighthouse sequences featuring Kieran Moore and Jeanette Scott, and they brought along Freddie Francis to direct those. So, you know, the whole idea of rampaging, sentient, malevolent, malicious plant life was not unfamiliar to poor old Freddie Francis.
It kind of comes to life when he gets the men from the Ministry or the Royal Chelsea Flower Show to come and investigate the vine itself. And there are some quite horrible bits in it, you know, where it kills the dog. The dog is quite a shock, I think. Probably would have got a lot of awes and ums from the audience watching in that time.
A dog strangled by a vine. I can hardly believe it.
A dog strangled by a vine? One could hardly believe it.
It's a lovely day. Why don't you go out and play?
It isn't any fun without Rusty.
She was really good, and she does that line really well, and there's a lot of subtlety in the pause before she says it. Yeah, I thought she was very good, having worked with children.
Played by Sarah Nichols, as she was called then. Now she goes by the name of Phoebe Nichols. She was 7 or 8 years old, I think, at the time the film was made. And of course she went on to have a long acting career. She appeared most notably in The Elephant Man, and she's also the mother of Tom Sturridge.
Now, John Burke, the guy who novelised Dr. Terror's House of Horrors, was permitted to come on the set and watch the filming, and he told Johnny Mains, who is himself an anthologist and who befriended him in the last years of his life, he told Johnny Mains that he saw the shooting of the Creeping Vine story, and he could confirm that Bernard Lee was the worse for drink, to put it mildly.
And you do wonder if perhaps he'd seen the script and thought, I'm not going to get through that line without a little tipple firsthand.
Basically had to be shot sitting down. And yet, Bernard Lee, who was probably sitting there thinking, you know, I've just done Goldfinger with Sean Connery and now I'm having to talk about sentient plant life. Nevertheless, he brings that same M-like authority to this man from the Ministry.
A plant like that could take over the world.
And Jeremy Kemp is the other man from the Ministry, you know, who has the ignominious end, being strangled by a creeping vine. And you just watch this episode and you think, well, I can admire what they're trying for here, but it doesn't quite work. The Creeping Vine also has a very nice actress in it called Anne Bell, who just not long ago, in September '63, had played a major role in a now lost Nigel Neal play called The Road for the BBC. So she was used to better parts than she gets in this film.
Lunch will be ready in a few moments.
Oh, yes, well, I'm really awfully busy at the moment. Mind if I skip lunch today?
You've got to eat something.
There's a funny bit, isn't there, when he looks down into the thing and just sees on the slate of the microscope a brain.
A brain? I was right.
I was right. It's like, what are you seeing? Has got little brains.
Well, the vine effects are all right.
You can just imagine the man behind the camera sort of waving the tendril in front of it.
I mean, you know, the fact that there's some chippy just out of frame twitching the vines towards people is fairly patently obvious, but I'm not sure in 1964 how it could have been any other way. I mean, you know, we could see a remake of it now, you know, rendered entirely sterile by CGI.
But, you know, it's thin on the ground, I guess, as a story. And then, of course, there's this thing where, quite by accident, again, because he's smoking in the house, we discover that they are afraid of fire. Again, quite a confused ending. Do they get away? He goes out to get help, and then they are patting out the fire. The creeping vine itself has become impervious to fire, has it? And then therefore, is he going to be dead inside? So it's an ambiguous ending that's not quite. You go, oh, what? Oh, and we're back into the carriage again.
And that's going to happen to me. Maybe to all of us.
One big hiccup that they did have during production was that Acker Bilk, who had been going to appear as the jazz trumpeter, was taken ill and was replaced at the last minute.
It's funny, the credits, because it's and Roy Castle, but it's odd that they've even chosen to single out Roy Castle as a big thing. I don't quite know why. Was that because it was going to be and Acker Bilk? But in brackets, but he had a heart attack.
He was offered this film because Acker-Bilk had to drop out, and they presumably needed a musician to convince.
You are a musician?
Yeah. A lot of people don't seem to think so.
Tubby Hayes was originally booked to write the score for the film, and eventually it was Elizabeth Lutyens that wrote it, but the jazz music that's featured in the Voodoo section was written by Tubby Hayes and recorded by Tubby Hayes. Tubby Hayes appears as part of Roy Castle's band, and although Roy Castle was a very accomplished musician himself, he's actually miming to Tubby Hayes throughout all of this, and it's a very, very, very good bit of miming, I have to say. And in fact was released many years later. In 2009 there was a record company called Trunk Records who put out a very limited edition 7-inch EP, limited to 666 copies. This contains 3 of the cuts from the film, including one of the vocal tracks with Kenny Lynch. It's now changing hands for huge sums of money. It's probably more of a cult item than the film itself these days.
Roy Castle was what we used to know as an all-round entertainer, a breed that we just don't seem to have anymore.
He does bring some humour to it. There's a kind of glint in his eye, and he's very youthful.
He gives a very different performance from the rest of the cast.
Okay. I'll have a try. The first time I've ever done this without chips.
He shakes up that carriage a little bit, him being there. It does feel like he's got a different dynamic to everybody else.
He inserts little bits of comic business. Just little moments like when he taps the cards, he clicks his fingers in between, just little touches like that.
It's like someone now casting someone you wouldn't think in a part, which I always think is refreshing to see.
He did go on to make Doctor Who and the Daleks after this film.
The young man who triggered off this strange journey.
Again with Peter Cushing as the Doctor's assistant.
Roy Castle attempts what we're told is a West Indies accent. He sounds to me more Calcutta than Trinidad, I have to say.
Well, on that sweet note, boys, we can all get ready to go to the West Indies.
It's a film of very odd accents. We've got Peter Cushing trying out half a dozen of them, and then we've got poor old Roy Castle trying a West Indian accent and not sounding like anything at all, really.
The Voodoo segment has some really quite nifty Subotsky dialogue.
Hey, I dig that calypso music, man. It's good, sung by a real West Indian.
But West Indian? You must be joking. I came out the East End. The first music I heard was Bow Bells.
Yeah.
Well, Kenny Lynch, of course, who, again, was part of our childhood growing up on TV entertainment shows.
Voodoo is the one thing you don't mess around with here.
The relationship between him and Roy Castle is very good. It feels like there's an authentic connection between them.
Kenny Lynch says to Roy Castle, "Who do you think sent that win? Kenny Ball?"
Who do you think sent that win? Kenny Ball? That was Voodoo, man.
Which, to anyone who's familiar with the Morecambe and Wise show and the fact that Kenny Ball and his jazzmen appeared on it regularly, they'll know just how funny that line is.
When they first arrive, Kenny Lynch is singing a song with a steel band, and the guy who's leading that band was a guy called Russell Henderson, who formed the first steel band in this country, and in 1964 was instrumental in setting up the Notting Hill Carnival.
Another reason I like the Voodoo story is because Harold Lang, I think, is a legendary figure to people who know their British horror very well, because he had been killed in a hospital lift by the mutated astronaut in the Quatermass experiment way back in 1954. And on that occasion, he was playing a rather sleazy private detective. And on this occasion, he's playing, surprise, surprise, a rather sleazy club owner and musician manager come agent. And, he was perfect for these parts.
You're gonna love me. Oh, yeah.
One interesting feature of Biff Bailey's encounter with the Voodoo High Priest is that the Voodoo High Priest is played by Christopher Carlos, who really was the go-to guy for Voodoo High Priests, because the same year he appeared in a very good episode of The Saint called Cibao, which was all about voodoo, and he played effectively the same character that he'd played in Dr. Terror's House of Horrors.
The idea of stealing voodoo music is a great idea.
The first indication that Roy Castle's character gets that there might be something in this voodoo thing is where he very blithely dismisses it, leans against a railing, which promptly gives way.
What can a voodoo god do to me?
The sequence with the railing is presumably, it looks like it's in the studio, but there's a cutaway then to him in the water, which would have been shot outside somewhere, because I can't imagine they would have created a pond. That would have been beyond the budget.
He's a bit of a little Englander. He's terribly crass. He's terribly Philistine. He's faced with an alien culture, and he's faced with something that is sacred to that culture. And as far as he's concerned, it's just a great tune, man. And, and I can reset it for jazz purposes.
It belongs to the god Damballa, known only to his own people For centuries.
Oh, well, if it's that old, then it's out of copyright.
Kind of in a petulant way says, well, it's out of copyright, I can. And then goes back with it anyway, and it kind of follows him.
Because he is one of the few characters in this film who, to a degree, deserves his comeuppance.
And then there's kind of a great sequence where he is followed home.
And this is one of at least two sequences in this film which play very like what was called a Luton walk. Val Luton had produced a number of very good chillers in the early 40s for RKO, which patented scenes where characters were stealthily pursued through streets or parks or whatever it may be. And there would then be a Luton bus, as it was called. What really started up the whole tradition of the jump scare. And, you know, these are used in the pursuit of Roy Castle.
There's some really nice shock moments in there.
Well, also, when you think about you only got 10 minutes for these stories, to actually invest a few minutes doing that, building up and allowing the air in it, that's a choice that, you know, it's a considered choice that's a filmmaker knowing what he's doing. And it has that great bit in it, but there's a lovely thing to have done then, where he stumbles upon the poster of Dr. Terror's House of Horrors.
And it's got some odd credits on this thing. The production is credited to Amicus/Regal. And Regal Entertainment was run by a guy called Joe Vigoda, who was the real hero of Dr. Terror's House of Horrors. He actually ended up putting up 3/4 of the budget for it. A deal with an American company had fallen through, and Vigoda stepped in, and he ran Regal Distributors. The other odd thing about the credits is that it credits characters from within the film, not the actors themselves. But it's an odd mix of characters. Franklin Marsh is in there, who's not in that story. And Sonny Coyne, who is Kenny Lynch's character, gets a mention, and Bailey gets a mention, and Dr. Shrek gets a mention. Why are none of the others mentioned?
It's very metatextual for those days.
Another extraordinary thing about the Voodoo story is that it is effectively an adaptation, uncredited, of a Cornell Woolrich story that was called The Dark Melody of Madness when it was published in magazine form in July 1935, Dime Mystery Magazine, but it was subsequently anthologized as Papa Benjamin and was adapted for radio in 1948, which Subotsky is likely to have heard, and as recently as 1961 it had appeared in the Boris Karloff-hosted anthology TV series Thriller. And Subotsky appears to have appropriated it without any form of credit whatsoever.
Voodoo wasn't unheard of in the cinema at this point. We'd had I Walked with a Zombie, White Zombie. Curse of the Voodoo by Lindsay Shonteff just preceded this film. It was mostly related to the Haitian zombie thing at the time. But it was one of the first of the British films to do it.
He's messed with voodoo jazz, and he shouldn't have done. And he's punished for it.
That'll teach me not to steal tunes.
I think my favourite segment would be the Disembodied Hand, because of Christopher Lee's performance in it.
What does it mean?
I'll tell you what it means. Absolutely nothing.
When he gets in that carriage, you think the last thing he's ever going to do is agree to have his fortune read. When he finally relents and goes, very well, it's interesting.
Very well. Very well. Shuffle your cards. Foretell my destiny.
I think it's interesting that Christopher Lee is the only one who doesn't tap the cards.
I kind of love it for that, the idea that Christopher Lee doesn't tap the cards. We know the setup now, we don't need to see it and get on with it. So and it's too strange to just be, we forgot to film it, and it's clearly you go straight into it. But yes, it's an odd choice. I'd love to know the thought process behind it.
His sequence opens with him in an art gallery doing what he does best, which is criticising art.
Well, I don't think there's very much more that we can say about that particular atrocity.
He's playing, effectively, to some degree anyway, a normal guy. You know, he's an art critic. He's seen in offices typing up his reports. He's a fellow who gives everyone a round in the pub. You know, this was a bit new. We'd seen Christopher Lee as misshapen monsters, as super sexy vampires, but a guy who holds down a normal job? No, this was new, and I think it was a great opportunity for him.
But I can see, Mr. Landau, I can see very well when there's something worth seeing.
Christopher Lee actually sets the whole thing up with, I live by my vision.
I live by my vision.
Which is a fantastic bit of foreshadowing of what's to come. You know, there are several references to seeing throughout that episode.
Ah, no, this is quite a different matter. Quite a different matter indeed. Clearly the work of a creative artist of considerable promise.
A great journey he goes on. He is cruel. I mean, he's probably one of the ones that do deserve his fate. You know, he's monstrous to to Michael Gough.
You could learn a great deal about painting from this artist, Mr. Landor.
Then I should very much like to meet him. Would that be possible?
He's here now, as a matter of fact.
Indeed.
And it is a good gag. It's very facile. Frankly, it's cheap and ridiculous, but it is a good gag. We are delighted to see Franklin Marsh deflated so spectacularly.
Featuring James the chimp, incidentally. James the artist chimp, he was mentioned in the press book.
I think the chimp gives a stellar performance. I don't know where he came from. There was a chimp that was quite an important feature of The Revenge of Frankenstein in 1958, which was a Hammer film with Peter Cushing. I don't know if it was the same chimp, but maybe it was maybe it was related.
He laughs too hard at his own triumph, I think.
Landor really goes for it subsequently in having his revenge.
By turning up wherever he is, just to belittle him by just being there.
Frankly, appears as petty and absurd as Marsh himself.
It's a very complex story to be told within a short segment, actually.
Subotsky is not just satirising pretentious art critics, he is also, of course, satirising the pretentious artist. I mean, modern art is rubbish, as I think was famously said once, of course. And I think that looks like it was Subotsky's standpoint. So basically, it's a plague on both your houses, the critic and the artist.
Just seeing that downward spiral into hysteria, he does it so well. And it's very rare at that point, particularly, to see Christopher Lee terrified. We've not seen it that often.
Once that hand starts to chase him, is how absolutely terrified he is by it.
If it works at all, it works because of Lee's reactions to it.
How hard would it be to act with a hand where it's crawling? And one of the odd things that I became mesmerised by with that hand was how when it goes forward, when it goes back, the fingers go up. It's a very strange detail, obviously the mechanics of it.
Now, Disembodied Hand required a special effect, and it was made by Ted Samuels in the Shepperton Special Effects Department. It set Amicus back £400, which in a budget of, I believe, 105,000 was quite a major outlay. And Subotsky became very fond of this hand, and so he reused it in a number of other Amicus films. In fact, it effectively plays the central role in And Now the Screaming Starts.
The dead hand that lives. And now the screaming starts. For them. And for you.
And it also appears in Tales from the Crypt. So, Subotsky definitely wanted to make the most out of it. He maintained that the initial shot of it in Franklin Marsh's car, when we see from the back seat, we see it sitting behind Christopher Lee and can clearly see the seam running along here.
They go to such lengths and then they've got clearly a seam there.
Subotsky said, yes, they were well aware that the seam was visible, but there was just no way they couldn't use the shot.
Big line along the edge. Just get a little knife, Stanley knife, and just... I'm sure you could have got it slightly better than he is.
I must say, watching the film, I have no idea why they had to have that shot. They could have shot it from a different angle. They could have left that shot out altogether. But, the seam is very visible at that point, which is a great shame because for a practical effect in 1964, it's very, very good. And it looks particularly good once it's been partially incinerated. It's a really horrible thing once it's blue and black and charred. And of course, once it's blue and black and charred, you can't see that bloody seam either.
And my favourite bit, you see a very close-up shot of Christopher Lee at the bar in a pub, pieing around, and a hand appears on his shoulder. And the genuine terror in his face as he turns round to see a little chap, the actor Kenneth Cove, asking Christopher Lee to buy him a drink.
The budgetary restrictions meant that they were pretty well confined to the studio nearly the whole time. And the only time we definitely see the outside world is when Christopher Lee is allowed to go out and try and dispose of the hand. He tries to dispose of it in a lake, which may well have served double duty as the lake that poor old Roy Castle falls into.
The Disembodied Hand story is another instance of Freddie Francis being faithful to actors he particularly liked.
There's a couple of little really nice cameos. Isla Blair plays the assistant in the gallery who brings out the chimpanzee.
Isla Blair, and 5 years down the line, 1969, she played one of Christopher Lee's beauteous victims in a very good Hammer horror called Taste the Blood of Dracula. Frank Forsyth turns up as the Toastmaster. Hedger Wallace turns up just as a doctor.
And Judy Cornwall plays the nurse.
Freddie Francis was very faithful like that, and if you're familiar with his films, and indeed with a lot of the TV episodes he made, you can see these same actors turning up time and again.
When he's had his story told, and it cuts back, and he's looking quite crestfallen And you can see in his eyes, he's like, actually, there's something to this after all. I've had my entire worldview changed in a matter of minutes.
Very pretty story. Thank you.
It's interesting to be talking about Christopher Lee's stellar performance in this film, because today is actually exactly a week since it was announced that he had died at the age of 93. And it was, it was delightful to see the real outpouring of grief that came from that. And all the wonderful tributes to him, because of course in the years since Dr. Terror's House of Horrors, he established himself as a really titanic, legendary figure of British and international cinema. I wrote a book about him, in point of fact, and that involved a good couple of years working quite closely with him, sifting through his immense archive and getting to know him quite well. And he really wasn't that Franklin Marsh type figure that people imagine. He was, underneath that exterior, he was very funny, dryly witty man. He had wonderful boyish enthusiasms, frankly. He'd show you his collection of Special Forces insignia with such delightful enthusiasm, and was so wonderfully helpful writing the book. Had no desire to be obstructive in any way. He didn't want it to be a whitewash of any kind. He wanted it to, tell it as it was. And he was a delight to be with, and I'm just so thrilled that he did have that incredible Indian summer in his career, thanks to Peter Jackson and George Lucas and other directors. He got to play Saruman and Count Dooku and was introduced to a whole new generation who maybe didn't identify him with Dracula at all because, they weren't around to enjoy those films. But they saw a man in his late 70s and into his 80s who, undiminished, had the same monolithic and really scary presence, undiminished in those later films. And to see and read all the tributes to him on his death was it was sad, but it was also a great vindication.
So the final segment is the vampire segment.
Milton Subotsky went on record saying that he couldn't take vampire stories seriously. Given that much of Hammer's success was founded on vampire stories, I'm sure, he said that quite advisedly. He just couldn't take them seriously. He thought they were stupid. So when vampire stories turned up in his Amicus films, they were always, to some degree, comedies.
Well, let's see what the cards have to say about me.
You are sure you wish to know?
It's exciting to see Donald Sutherland in Dr. Terror's House of Horrors, an actor at the very outset of his career. He began his career effectively in Britain. And oddly enough, he began his career in horror films. He very quickly got out of them, but he appeared in 3 in rapid succession in 1964. In February 1964, he did a show at the Royal Court Theatre called Spoon River Anthology, and it so happened that an American director called Warren Kiefer and an American director called Paul Maslansky were in the audience, and they were looking for somebody to appear in an Italian film they were about to make called Il Castello dei Morti Vivi, the Castle of the Living Dead, which oddly enough was headlined by Christopher Lee.
The Castle of the Living Dead. In an atmosphere of horror, the story of a man who violates the forbidden frontiers of science.
It's a very nice film. Another person who went to the Royal Court, though I believe on this occasion to a Sunday night recital of poetry readings, which Sutherland participated in, was Freddie Francis. And hence, as soon as Sutherland came back from Rome, having made Il Castello dei Morti Vivi, he was put straight into Dr. Terror's House of Horrors. In May, June 64. By August, he's making a Hammer film, Fanatic, in which he plays a handyman. So Dr. Terror's House of Horrors gives him his most normal role, but it's not actually a very good role. He has to be extraordinarily credulous.
I don't think he's very well served by the script here, because he's painted as a bit of a gullible fool throughout. This man who he's barely met comes in and tells him, your wife's a vampire, kill her, and he goes, okay.
The only way to kill a vampire is to drive a wooden stake through its heart.
Unfortunately for Sutherland, he's acting against the actor Max Adrian, who was a phenomenally experienced stage and film actor who really steals the scenes at every opportunity.
Yeah, Max Adrian, he's great. He's got a sinister presence, right from the start when you first see him.
And he had an incredible career. He was a very, very renowned Shakespearean actor. He worked with Olivier and Gielgud. And apparently at the beginning of his career, he had a very brief stint with Todd Slaughter's company as well, which would have been a nice little training for his later horror career. The other major female character within the film is the character of the vampire.
Is played by Jennifer Jane, who is a lovely actress, and she has a moment that, as everybody points out, is a quote from Nosferatu, but also is a very phallic kind of moment when she sucks Sutherland's finger.
As we know, Subotsky was quite the horror film fan. And Nosferatu would have been one of those films, I'm sure, that he absolutely loved. And I think we can see that very clearly because he names his villainous character Dr. Schreck. Max Schreck, of course, played the vampire in Nosferatu.
And she gives a very good performance. She does a great French accent.
A vampire?
Yeah, that's what Dr. Blake said. Can you imagine, in this day and age?
She was actually a personal friend of Freddie Francis, and several years down the line, in 1972, along with her husband, and under a collective pseudonym, she wrote a film for him called Tales That Witness Madness.
Tales that witness madness. It's enough to drive you out of your mind and into your grave.
Which, oddly enough, is always mistaken as an Amicus film because it follows the Amicus template of being a portmanteau film. It isn't, and it's really quite poor, but nevertheless, Jennifer Jane, having appeared in Dr. Terror's House of Horrors, went ahead and wrote a portmanteau film.
Sweetheart?
I got to close the window. I caught my hand.
I think Subotsky's attitude to vampire stories is indicated not just by the fact that the vampire story is effectively a punchline with a build-up, but also in the fact that he did put in some gags prior to that. At one point, Sutherland and Jennifer Jane are having dinner together, and Sutherland actually says, "Do you want some more steak, honey?"
Do you want some more steak, honey?
No.
Which I think was meant to get a laugh from the more savvy members of the audience. It's a bit of a hoary old gag, it must be said.
The woman who plays the mother of the boy is an actress called Irene Richmond, who came to acting late in life. And it's interesting because that segment is all set in America, but she doesn't seem to be attempting an American accent at all.
Well, he always sleeps with his window open.
She had been in Saturday Night and Sunday Morning, so she had a reasonably successful film career. So she's another little interesting face to look out for in there.
The vampire story is the other instance in this film of a Luton walk being put in. It's very, very consciously a Luton walk, in that Max Adrian, who of course turns out to be a vampire himself, is pursued down the stairs of the Institute, and then a little twist on it all is added by the fact that Adrian decides to actually go back up the stairs to effectively pursue his pursuer back up the stairs. But it all ends with a scene that for me doesn't quite make sense, in that when Jennifer Jane finally manifests herself as a bat and has a go at Max Adrian, he manages to fend her off by inadvertently making the sign of the cross with his elbows. And given that he is himself a vampire, I'm not sure how he managed it.
And the great reveal is that he is a vampire.
This town isn't big enough for two doctors or two vampires.
Never seen anything like it. It's a lovely idea. He's turning into the bat and flying away. Is a funny note to end the stories on. You know, normally you would get a really horrible story at the end, but it kind of is. It's a flourish.
There are 5 of us here, and none of us has a future.
And then we have this quite strange ending, where Dr. Schreck tells them that they have died, and he is dead, and they're already dead, so their fates are sealed. It's not quite, there's no kind of redemptive or out as far as them being, once they're in that train carriage, that's the end of them, really.
They were just ordinary people. They could have been us. You know, they were just like us, and they were having this horrible retribution visited on them for no reason whatsoever.
My favourite line in it, you're probably going to come to ask me, but I'll tell you now, is, have you not guessed? He says, who are you?
Who are you? If you've not guessed.
Maybe the ultimate moral is you can't not die, whoever you are.
Dr. Schreck.
The film was Amicus's first attempt at a portmanteau, and clearly British audiences hadn't seen anything like this since Dead of Night, and the reception was really very good.
The film was released in the UK in January 1965 and in America 2 months later.
Well, when Dr. Terror's House of Horrors came out, it had no big West End opening. You know, there was no razzmatazz attached to it. I think it came out at 2 slightly off-West End, if you like, cinemas, the ABC Fulham Road and the ABC Bayswater. But nevertheless, it did extremely well.
It was surprising how well it was received by the critics.
One newspaper described it as a horror and pop film, bringing together of lots of different elements of British culture.
I think we have this perception that the mainstream critics never liked British horror, but they did seem to like this one.
And describing the fact that it had macabre joys, which I think is quite a nice sort of description of the film.
It got some good crits, and I think Hammer must have been aware, okay, right, we've got a rival here.
The reception of the film was very good. I think we watch it now through maybe different eyes, and having seen Amicus's later films, when Subotsky clearly realised that possibly he wasn't the best person to be writing the stories, and they went to really good horror writers such as Robert Bloch. We've seen all those films, but of course audiences watching it then had nothing to compare it to, so I think the press were very encouraging.
And of course, we hear echoes of it to this day. In 1978, one of the stars of this film, Christopher Lee, hosted Saturday Night Live. And he referred to Dr. Terror's House of Pancakes. In the beginning of the 21st century, there was a series of spoof horror stories produced by the BBC called Dr. Terrible's House of Horrible. But I think the most interesting appropriation, indicating that Hammer were aware that they had a rival, was the fact that very soon after this film came out, in fact, March 1966, they put out a double bill of Rasputin the Mad Monk and the Reptile. They, for the first time, said on the posters, "From Hammer, the House of Horror." And I think this was very much cocking a snook, as it were, at Amicus by effectively borrowing the title of Amicus's first success and appropriating it for themselves. And of course, ever since, in particular because of the 1980 TV series Hammer House of Horror, you know, Hammer have owned that brand, and yet, in a funny sort of way, Subotsky originated that.
I think the biggest influence was on Amicus themselves, where they saw that this format worked and this was something they could do in the future. They'd already got The Skull under production or pre-production at the time, so they were kind of committed to that. But then they started a whole string of these anthology films, and they really hit their stride with that, and that I think is what we know them for now more than anything else.